Yeah, we back. Yeah, we back. Now, today is going to be a different type of video. In this video, I'm going to be making a geopolitical prediction, right? Based on how I see the landscape being formed right now and what I can see happening in the future. Now, before I get started, I just want to lay down the groundwork for the discussion, right? Now, when you look at the youth, right, the young men of today, right, the teenagers, the 20-somethings, right, the young people coming up, in the future, they're going to be the defense ministers, the policy advisors, the chiefs of staff, right? The national security, the prime ministers, the presidents, they're going to be the future leaders, right? In the decades to come. Now, when you observe, especially among young white males, especially, you see a lot of them leaning more towards the conservative side of the spectrum, the more nationalistic side of the spectrum. And we can see that by how many of them resonate with President Donald Trump, but also, for example, Elon Musk, who ever since he took over the ownership of Twitter, for example, which is pretty much the largest information database currently right now for public discourse and the sharing of news, it has now become a safe haven and a hotbed for certain rhetoric. And you can see that essentially, like I said in previous videos, that old school racism, it's back into effect, right? The old school racism, it's back, right? I'm talking about conversations about IQ and racial hierarchy, and essentially the same type of talking points that you would see in a book from Arthur de Gobineau or somebody like Lothrop Stoddard is essentially becoming mainstream conversation once again, especially amongst these conservative circles, which, like I said before, the young white man is leaning heavily into that side of the political spectrum. Now, like I said before, these young men are going to be in the future the defense ministers, the policy advisors, the four-star generals, right? Now, like we discussed before, especially in many Western nations, the United States, France, et cetera, the UK, they're experiencing demographic decline and demographic transformation, right? Their influence and dominance is not as prominent as it once was. Now, these young men today who are in these far right echo chambers right now as young men, when they become older and they become the leaders of tomorrow and they have the power to actually carry out their own agenda and their own policies, it is my prediction that these young men of today, in the future, they'll be taking violent action in order to protect the interests of Western nations and Western influence. Just a few weeks ago, we saw the French government make a failed attempt at trying to overthrow the government in Mali, right? So we already see that direct violent action is already beginning to take place. We're already going back to the old school already, right? Now, I'm just saying that I believe that more direct violent tactics like this will be happening in the future, especially as governments begin to move in a more sovereign direction and take certain actions that benefit themselves and their population above the interests of foreign powers, right? Now, I want to flashback to, if you remember a while back, Celeste Wallander, a high-ranking U.S. diplomat in the arena of security and diplomacy. If you remember that clip that she had said, where she laid it out plain and simple. Take a look up on the screen.
Africa is not merely important, it is essential. African partnerships are critical for the Department of Defense to maintain its technological edge, accomplish its geopolitical and strategic objectives, and power our futures.
All right, we back. Now, I remember when I was a kid, the narrative was about charity. Oh, we are in Africa to do charity. We are in Africa to provide security and peace and stability. We're in Africa to be good Samaritans. But now you realize that the rhetoric has kind of changed, where now they're kind of becoming more honest about their intentions, right? Where you have individuals like Celeste Wallander just coming out and saying that Africa is essential to our geopolitical objectives in the arena of technology and defense. And if you remember, I did a video a while back on a gentleman by the name of Francois Lecointe, who is a high-ranking French general. I believe he was the top-ranking French general not too long ago. And take a look up on the screen. Retired French Army General Francois Lecointe has repeatedly stressed the importance of European security interests in Africa. While he has not explicitly stated that Europe must protect its interests through force, he has linked European stability to the state of affairs in Africa. Now, I'm going to refresh your memory and play some of those clips from that video. I'll be right back.
What is our destiny? As for us Europeans, is the Mediterranean and Africa, where our destiny is at stake. And so we have constantly tried, we French, to draw Europeans into this awareness of the need to act collectively in Africa and the Mediterranean. And I am absolutely sorry to see the failure of our commitments in the Sahel. Surely we'll need to revisit the question nonetheless. In addition, a continent which will experience a demographic explosion like no continent has ever experienced. And so imagine that it happens there in the next 10, 20 years, and that it will have no consequences on Europe. And so I think that this common interest should one day make Europe decide to act as a political entity, and that it will defend its interests itself, including by means of the commitment of its armies.
Now, not only in that clip, you heard him basically put out a call to arms to all European nations to protect their interests on the continent, but also he made a reference to the demographic explosion that is predicted to happen on the continent. If you remember the videos I dropped the other day about Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and the African birth rates, I told you, see, this is a high-ranking French general. I think he was the chief of the entire French armed forces, and he is having the same conversation, the African birth rates, right? The demographic transformation, right? The European nations, the Western nations are in decline demographically, whereas on the African continent is projected to explode, and they're taking all that into account. Now, why are all these men of prominence worried about the birth rates? Why is Elon Musk worried about the birth rates? Why is Bill Gates worried about the birth rates and giving out contraceptives? Why is this French general worried about the African birth rates? Like I told you before, their populations are currently in decline. Their women aren't having that many babies. Their women don't want to have their babies. You know, they don't want to be sitting around raising their kids like that. They rather go do something else. They rather go to work. They rather date other races of men. They rather just be single and just travel the world. They don't want to be sitting around raising the white man's babies, right? So their population is in decline, right? Our population is in the direct opposite. It's currently on an upward trajectory, currently set to double, triple, and quadruple over the next century or so. In contrast to Western nations where the population is aging and getting older and they don't have enough young people to replace the workforce and to provide revenue for the state. So they're also looking at it like if the average age in my country is like 46 and the average age over there is like, 23, that creates an issue. Also, this may lead to more migrants coming into their country. Of course, we can't forget the most important topic, which is more resource competition. If the population on the continent increases, that means if you have more people, that means more consumption. Instead of the resources being shipped off, extracted for cheap into the Western supply chains, you're going to see more and more leaders take certain actions to keep those resources at home for the benefit of the population, especially because they have so many mouths to feed. You're going to have a young population. They're going to be angry. They're going to be fired up. They're going to be demanding change. And that also played a role in France's expulsion from West Africa, from the nations that kicked out the French, because you had a very young population. They took to the streets. They were screaming death to the French government, and the military leaders in the Sahel, for example, rode into power based off that sentiment, based off that wave. So when you have a young population, a large population demanding change from their government, that's going to be a detriment to Western interests, because more and more of those coveted resources are going to be staying at home for local consumption instead of being shipped off and extracted for cheap to foreign countries, right? Now, going back to what I said before, the young men of today, the young 19-year-old, the young 23-year-old in these far-right conservative echo chambers who's indulging on all type of, problematic rhetoric. Now, when the young men of today become the leaders of tomorrow and they're in the position to so-called defend Western civilization, it is my prediction that these men will be taking direct, violent action to defend their interests, right? We can take France, for example, as a nation currently in demographic decline and also losing their influence and strength in Africa. And I just saw an article that came out the other day, for example, take a look up on the screen. France may need an IMF bailout, according to the finance minister. Now, like I said before, due to the fact that racism has become mainstream once again, these young men of today, when they become the leaders of tomorrow, similar to their forefathers from the 19th century who engaged in all type of barbarity and crimes against humanity, I believe that these guys are going to lash out violently in order to protect their interests, right? Kind of like a man that is drowning, right? When a man is drowning, what happens before he goes under the water and dies? When a man is drowning, he's throwing his arms around, he's flailing around violently, he's thrashing in the water, desperate for air, right? So I believe the same thing is going to happen. They're going to lash out militarily, economically, geopolitically, diplomatically, and even the French general says that we need to defend our interests even by employing our armies, right? So that's my prediction. So due to that prediction, I believe that we need to take certain measures in anticipation of that and begin developing certain systems and mechanisms of defense in anticipation of that, because I do believe in the future there's going to be some great war on the continent. I do believe in the future there's going to be a great war on the continent. all the ingredients are there. You have demographics in decline, right? You have resource competition as resources become more scarce and as more governments begin to assert their sovereignty and assert their dignity. You have young white men, young Western men in these online echo chambers who, like I said, will grow up to be tomorrow's generals and policy advisors. And when their back is against the wall, I do believe that they're going to respond with direct violence. And not only direct violence, but also the typical methods of sabotage as well, like information warfare, propaganda warfare, covert operations to overthrow the government, right? Things that are already happening right now, but I believe it's going to get more intense as time goes on. I believe it's going to get more intense and more direct. That's why when it comes to me, I believe in things like African nations coordinating when it comes to their militaries, because obviously when it comes to the adversary, they're moving as one block. It's not an individual nation that's going to be approaching, right? They're coming as one united block. So I also believe that African militaries also need to coordinate in a similar manner. Also, when it comes to weapons, I believe that weapons need to be manufactured domestically. We already know when it comes to the Western nations, they're not going to sell us any material. They're not going to sell us any weapons. Now, when it comes to nations like Turkey, Russia, China, they'll sell us weapons and that's fine. But we need to reverse engineer that and manufacture our own domestically created weapons. That way, you're not dependent on any specific source for weapons, but you have your own stable supply. We need to trade more amongst each other and also other black nations abroad. We need to circulate more money and engage in commerce more amongst each other. So that way we're not so vulnerable to sanctions because we're tied to, trade relations with hostile powers. Also, when it comes to the media, we need to do a better job of controlling our narrative, which has actually improved in recent times as the flow of information has become more democratic. And we're now able to counter the false information and propaganda they put out into the atmosphere. And also, last but not least, invest into the youth, invest into creating young patriotic children, because like I said, the children are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And in fact, I saw an initiative, if you remember, I did a video a while back about Captain Ibrahim Traore, the patriotic training camp for the young children that he instilled as mandatory for the curriculum. Take a look up on the screen, right? So you have to begin to sensitize the minds of the children to the reality, the international reality, the geopolitical reality of which they'll be forced to face in the future. That's what I would do, right? Number one, invest in national defense. Number two, control and dominate your narrative in the media. And number three, make sure you are educating and training the children properly to be able to defend themselves against the incoming threats. Because I truly believe, I swear to God, in my heart of hearts, I truly believe that there's going to be a violent confrontation on the continent, right? We already kind of seeing, the tension bubbling already, right? Now, I do believe one day it's just going to be an all-out explosion, right? So I think that, as black men, as African men, we have to be aware of that. That's where I see things going with the rise of white nationalism, with the collapse of demographics in Western societies, as Africa begins to assert its legitimacy and sovereignty on the international stage, which undermines Western interests and economic prosperity. I think that eventually this is going to lead to a violent confrontation amongst men of African descent and men of European descent. Now, of course, in a perfect world, we should all be able to live in harmony and the resources will be equally distributed in an equitable manner. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. Unfortunately, we live in reality. And when you live in reality, there's something called hostile adversaries, of which we have multiple. So that's just the reality. Anyways, it's your boy Neferkari Dessalines back in the building. Yes, indeed. Subscribe to the Patreon NCD 1814. Check out the second single off the next project, The Spy in Bamako. Link in the description, pinned comment at the top, and I'm gone. Peace.
Gotta stay focused, so when it's in shots, I gotta react. Cause I'm a target, I'm under attack. Grabbing a weapon, I tell him get back. Mission exposed, secrets unfold. Enemy try, but I'm still in control. Got your boy sitting in Bamako prison, hoping they wish we sending them home. Enemy know that we good under pressure. Been through the thunderous, turbulent storm. Shorty a diamond, I told her she pressure. Hop in a whip and I'm taking her home. Hop in a whip and I'm swerving, I'm smashed. Killing my enemies, one of my passion. Rocking this gold like we in bikini. Feel like the captain, I'm clutching a heater. Feel like they see me, I feel like I'm Saudi or ran up on Yana in the middle of Bamako. Enemy line, they claiming he innocent. Don't do no talking, I gotta move militant. Don't do no talking, I hit him with facts. 1804, bringing it back.